Et nominus Patris Sanctus, Domino nomine Patri, et Filii, etc., etc., etc. Hello, and welcome to the Divine Temple. Or, more likely, hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great Player, where we look at the Cleric. Now, I do have to confess, so far we've looked at the Paladin, we've looked at the Wizard, we've looked at the Ranger, and they've all been fairly easy for me to put together my thoughts on why they're so entertaining to play. The Cleric made me think. It made me think really long and really hard. And I'm flummoxed by it, and I do find it rather curious. So I wonder if you share my thoughts on the matter. So when we look at the Cleric, let's just jump straight in here. We look at the merits of the Cleric. There isn't another class that can touch the Cleric from merit. Weapons, heavy armor, and magic. Oh, and I can turn undead too. The Cleric's got it all. It literally has everything. The Cleric class can heal itself, turn undead, beat the living snot out of anything that comes running up to it, and take a beating as well. So why, and this is a genuine question, is everybody not playing a Cleric? They can do everything that a fighter can do, they can do everything a paladin can do, they can do everything a mage can do, they can do everything that no one else can do, which is turn undead. So the Cleric is a remarkably powerful class, and yet I find myself still paused for thought. They have, as a merit, religion, the belief in a higher power. Now, unlike the Paladin, whose belief is an unwavering line of thought to their code, as people rightly pointed out, to their oath, to their convictions, the Cleric is really just there to interpret scripture, be a messenger of the gods, and, one day become a god, because, well, they can do everything, so I don't see why not. Now this brings me to the negatives, the cons of a Cleric, is that for all of this amazing ability that they have, they don't seem to be very fun. They seem to be like the character that because they can do everything, because they are these superheroes amongst the classes, they're a bit boring. Or at least that's what I found anyway. So I had to go digging further. So they can be boring. They can be incredibly overwhelming. You've got magic on the one hand, you've got your traditional combat on the other, you've got turning undead, you've got healing spells that just come out of nowhere. So the Cleric class can be overwhelming in terms of everything that it can do, because it can do a tremendous amount of things. So that's something to bear in mind. That's a negative. They're also not the master of anything in particular. So if a Cleric went toe-to-toe with a fighter and didn't use their spells, the fighter would win. They have abilities and capacities that the Cleric just doesn't have access to. On the other hand, if they were to take their spells and they were to go toe-to-toe with a Wizard, ultimately I think the Wizard would win, if the Wizard got the drop on the Cleric. And the Cleric was fairly low level. Kinda. They can be bland. They can have the religion thing. Now, as a negative, it's a positive for the priest, for the Cleric, because it gives them something to roleplay with, and there's all sorts of bonuses and things that are going to come up a little bit later that the Cleric gets access to because of that strong religious connection. It is also a negative because if the player of the Cleric, if you are playing a Cleric, for example, and you don't embody the religion, your GM is likely to say, you lose your spells. You're not following what your god has said. So adding on to the complexity of the spells of combat, you now have this religious requirement which you now have to fulfill and follow. And your GM should have given you the basic outlines of that faith or religion, or you should have picked it up from the book, and you should be following it. So it can be a negative. If we look at the potentials, the potentials. The potentials are rich, rich lore. So all this canonical lore, the saints, the people who've come before, the avatars of the gods. The priest, the cleric, has access to all of that and can become that, by the way. The cleric is the character most likely to become divine, followed closely by the monk, and then the paladin, and then all the other classes slowly get towards deification later on. But it is the cleric who stands first and foremost as their god's conduit onto the planet. So that's a big story. They can have a focused narrative where it's focused around the clergy, focused around the monasteries, focused around that particular space that religious dogma finds us in. And that can create quite an interesting campaign. They are also undead hunters. So they can have campaigns that are focused specifically on undead and not have too much of a problem with it. They're not going to have to hack and slash through every single kind of encounter. So the potential for the cleric is huge. They can do almost anything that they like, and they can be very good at it as well. And that's something that I think is very, very important. The different types of clerics. Now, this is where I thought, I will now find the reason why we don't see everybody playing clerics, apart from the negatives, of course. This is where we will find that the cleric only has one or two styles. While the cleric doesn't. There are more cleric types and options than almost there are wizard types and options. Wizards still win, but clerics come close. You've got the battle cleric. The cleric who wears heavy plate armor, wields a mace, wields a shield, and goes into battle and hits things and uses their divine magic to enhance their damage dealing, to enhance their abilities, and to just strike the wrath of their god into their foes. So that's the battle cleric. Quite an intimidating force and arguably a very dangerous opponent. You get the priestly type of cleric, the father, the abbot, the monk, and I mean monk as in brown robes, bald, central point, I forget the name of it, and the one who sings in choirs and is quiet and reserved and divine-like. So the priestly kind is the one who does a little bit of healing, does a little bit of administration, does a little bit of support, maybe gives some advice to the players, the fellow players, characters, is the sedate kind. You get that kind of priest. You get the healer, of course, the priest who focuses primarily on healing, and it's not just using magic, it's using their skills as well to push that healing. The priests are, without doubt, the greatest of healers because they can use any spell they like as a healing spell, and that's very powerful. So they can become the healer, in which case, like that Hospitalier Paladin of last week, they could become a priest who does no harm because they are the ultimate doctor. And so that's an option for you. An undead hunter, obviously, is something that a priest can become. No other class can hunt undead like the priest can. Wizards can go in and use necromancy to try and control the undead, but ultimately it's the priest who can go in and turn them to dust by holding up their holy symbol, and that's it. The undead are gone. There's nothing they can do about it. So the undead hunter is a class that the priests can really explore and capitalize on. The zealot. Now, the zealot is something that I find quite interesting. And the zealot is the type that quite literally embodies what their god says and will fulfill it to their ultimate nth degree. Now, a paladin is almost like a zealot, except the paladin has taken vows to act and do things on behalf of their gods in a certain way, or their oaths. The cleric who is a zealot is the cleric who doesn't see anything outside of their space. Anything outside of their god's domain is for them blasphemy, and they will hunt it down and destroy it. And a zealot cleric, using all of their combat, martial abilities, plus their spells, becomes a dangerous fanatic that could be very interesting to play. Then you get the shield. The shield is a battle cleric or a cleric who goes into combat expressly to keep their companions alive. Yes, they'll do a little bit of healing here and there, but primarily their function is to enarmor their fellows, to shield them, to distract the enemy, to keep the enemy at bay, but not necessarily to destroy the enemy either. It's a much more versatile, utilitarian type of cleric than the rest are. They're there to support and to make sure that others get through. And that's also a very interesting space to be in. Can you prevent your party from dying or taking massive damage before it happens, rather than the healer who picks up the pieces afterwards, or the battle cleric who goes in and makes all the pieces? So the cleric has got a lot of different types that can be played. So why aren't we seeing more clerics being chosen? A party of clerics is a party that would be almost impossible to kill, simply because, oh, he fell over. I resurrect. No, I resurrect him. Oh, I'll beat you to a pulp. No, you won't, because you can't hit me, because my armor class is so high. But I appreciate the sentiment. You go ahead and resurrect him. So, nonetheless, it's a party of people who just won't ever leave the planet. Now, from a stories perspective, of course, we've got all the different types of stories that'll come through. We've got the religious stories, we've got combat stories, we've got healing stories. A lot of it could be undead stories because, well, again, of that power of turning the undead. And of course, the two big ones that we've got is the Salvation Damnation one, which is very similar to what the Paladin had in terms of his fall from grace and then his return to grace. But the Salvation Damnation option of the priest, of the cleric, is, I think, a little bit more consequential. Paladins, the gods aren't fighting over their paladins, they're fighting with their paladins. A cleric, on the other hand, might have an evil deity in opposition to their own, tempting them to come to the dark side. For me, a cleric is more like a Jedi or a Sith warrior than any of the other classes. Forget the poor old paladin. They've got codes and things which, yes, is very Jedi-like, but the temptation, in my opinion, is far greater on a cleric than it is on a paladin. And a cleric makes more sense to me as a Jedi or a Sith type of persona, where you've got this battle between the wills, between good and evil, and the gods themselves. So clerics are a very, very, very dynamic class, a very capable class, a very survivable class, and yet we don't see them that often. Now, I have to tell you a story of a player of mine who played a cleric and who made sure that the prayer of the cleric was uttered so often. They would utter it at the beginning of the battle, at the end of the battle, during dialogue, before meals, after meals. They really drove home this idea of this prayer that everybody at the table ultimately converted to that particular god and could recite the prayer. That's how powerful just recite, and it wasn't a complicated thing. Life is death, death is life. Death is rebirth, rebirth is life. Life is death, death is rebirth, rebirth is life. Just this simple mantra which he would repeat over and over and over and over and over again. And we got this amazing conversion of the rest of the players' characters to that god, as well as, of course, the entrenchment of that god in the characters. And I, as a GM, had a lot of fun playing with trying to lure that character away from their god and tempt them and that kind of thing. So the cleric is something that we need to explore more, I feel. And if you do play a cleric, please put in the comments below. Tell us what you like about the cleric. Tell us why we should be playing a party of clerics and nothing else. Let's champion the cleric a little bit, because I think they may get the short end of the stick in terms of being looked at as a class of being slightly boring. They are anything but boring. Until next time, join us on social media. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, we're all over the place. Come and find us and join the conversation so we can unpack these things together and see what we can come up with as to why we like or don't like particular classes. Until next time, though, I wish you and yours the happiest of gaming.